Hi, I'm Professor Hospital. I'm also a poet and a creative writing teacher, so I'm going to be reading some poetry. Poets deal with their struggle for civil rights in a more intimate way. So I'm going to read some poetry, starting with Langston Hughes and moving through several other African-American poets till I get to a contemporary young poet called John Murillo. Dream Variation by Langston Hughes. To fling my arms wide in some place of the sun, to whirl and to dance till the white day is done, then rest at cool evening beneath a tall tree, while night comes on gently, dark like me. That is my dream. To fling my arms wide in the face of the sun, dance, whirl, whirl, till the quick day is done, rest at pale night, a tall, slim tree, night coming tenderly, black like me. I Dream a World by Langston Hughes. I dream a world where man, no other man will scorn, where love will bless the earth and peace its path adorn. I dream a world where all will know sweet freedom's way, where greed no longer saps the soul, nor avarice blights our day. A world I dream where black or white, whatever race you be, will share the bounties of the earth, and every man is free. Where wretchedness will hang its head, and joy, like a pearl, attends the needs of all mankind. Of such I dream my world. This is a longer poem by Quincy Troupe called Old Black Lady Standing on Bus Stop Corners, number 2. Blue, black, and bow bent under, beautiful. Blue back and bow bent under, beautiful. Blue back and bow bent under, beautiful. And it never did matter whether the weather was flame tongue licked or as cold as a well digger's asshole in late December when Santa Claus was working his cold money bullshit that made financiers grin ear to ear all the way to secret bank vaults overflowing with marble eyes of dirt poor children. Blue, black, and bow bent under, beautiful. Blue back and bow bent under, beautiful. Blue back and bow bent under, beautiful. Never did matter whether the days were storm-raked, unzipped by lightning, streaking clouds, dropping tornadoes that skipped crazy to their own exploding beat, shooting hailstone death that popped like old bones, crashing into the skulled, sunken eyes of tired old ladies, tired old black ladies standing on bus stop corners, pain wrapped as shawls around their necks, blue back and bow bent under, beautiful. And mama, it didn't matter that your pain-scarred feet, overworked, numb legs grew down out of old worn dresses, seemingly fragile, gaunt, and skeletal frail as two old mop sticks, scarecrow legs. Didn't matter because you stood there anyway, defying nature's chameleon weather, cold as a well digger's asshole, then oven hot, defying all reason. You stood there, testifying, over 300 years, stretching back, of madness and treason. Blue back and bow bent under, beautiful. No, it didn't matter, because the beauty of your heroic life, grown lovely in twisted swamps, grown lovely in a loveless land, grown pure and full from wombs of concrete blood and bones, of concrete blood and bones and death, of death and sweat chained to breath, didn't matter, dark, proud flower who stood tall, scrubbed by cold and rain and heat and age, carrying the foreign name given your grandfather, who swayed body high, twisting and turning in the breeze like Billy's strange fruit. Because you stood there anyway, unforgettably silent in your standing, beautiful work-scarred black lady, numb legs and bow bent under, beautiful, stood there on pain-scarred feet, overworked, numb legs and bow bent under, beautiful, under the memory of your grandfather swaying high, up there in a burning southern breeze. Now sweet music, love sings of tender beauty, deep in your washed, aging windows, and gave me strength during the mad, bizarre days. And we have learned to love your life and will vindicate the pain and silence of your life, the memory of your grandfather with the foreign name, and who sways high up there in history over your legs, blue, black, and bow bent under, beautiful. The weight of over 300 years carried of blood and bones and death in mud, of breath and sweat chained to death, numb legs and bow bent under, beautiful, under the memory of your grandfather swaying high up there in the burning breeze. Didn't matter whether the weather was flame-tongue licked or as cold as a well-digger's asshole in late December, because you stood there anyway, in full bloom of your strength and rare beauty, and made us strong. Blue, black, and bow bent under, beautiful. Blue, black, and bow bent under, beautiful. Blue, back, and bow bent under, beautiful. Stations by Audre Lorde. Some women love to wait for life, for a ring in the June light, for a touch of the sun to heal them, for another woman's voice to make them whole, to untie their hands, put words in their mouths, form to their passages, sound to their screams, for some other sleeper to remember their future, their past. Some women wait for their right train in the wrong station, in the alleys of mourning, for the noon to holler the night come down. Some women wait for love to rise up, the child of their promise, to gather from earth what they do not plant, to claim pain for labor, to become the tip of an arrow, to aim at the heart of now, but it never stays. Some women wait for visions that do not return, where they were not welcome, naked, for invitations to places they always wanted to visit, to be repeated. Some women wait for themselves around the next corner and call the empty spot peace, but the opposite of living is only not living, and the stars do not care. Some women wait for something to change, and nothing does change, so they change themselves. Walking Down Park by Nikki Giovanni. Walking down Park Amsterdam or Columbus, do you ever stop to think what it looked like before it was an avenue? Did you ever stop to think what you walked before you rode subways to the stock exchange? We can't be on the stock exchange, we are the stock exchanged. Did you ever maybe wonder what grass was like before they rolled it into a ball and called it Central Park, where syphilitic dogs and their two-legged tubercular masters fertilized the corners and sidewalks? Ever want to know what would happen if your life could be fertilized by a love thought from a loved one who loves you? Ever look south on a clear day and not see Times Squares, but see tall birch trees with sycamores touching hands and see gazelles running playfully after the lions? Ever hear the antelope bark from the third-floor apartment? Did you ever sit down and wonder about what freedom would bring? It's so easy to be free. You start by loving yourself, then those who look like you. All else will come naturally. Ever wonder why so much asphalt was laid in so little space? Probably so we would forget the Iroquois, Algonquin, and Mohicans who could caress the earth. Ever think what Harlem would be like if our herbs and roots and elephant ears grew, sending a cacophony of sounds to us? The parrot parroting black is beautiful, owl sending out who's making love, and me and you just sitting in the sun trying to find a way to get a banana from one of the monkeys, koala bears in the trees, laughing at our listlessness. Ever think it's possible for us to be happy? Please, by Yusef Komunayaka. Forgive me, soldier. Forgive my right hand for pointing you to the flawless tree line now outlined in my brain. There was so much blood sky over our heads at daybreak in Pleiku, but I won't say those infernal guns blinded me on the hill. Mistakes piled up men like clouds, pushed to the dark side. Sometimes I try to retrace them, running my fingers down the map, telling less than a woman's body. We followed the grid, coordinates in some battalion commander's mind. If I could make my mouth unsay those orders, I'd holler, "Don't move a muscle, stay put, and keep your fucking head down, soldier." Ambush, gunsmoke. Last night while making love, I cried out, "Hit the dirt." I've tried to swallow my tongue. You were a greenhorn, so fearless, even foolish, and when I said go, Henry, you went dancing on a red string of bullets from that tree line as it moved from a low cloud. The Lost Baby poem by Lucille Clifton. The time I dropped you almost body down, down to meet the waters under the city and run one with the sewage to the sea, what did I know about waters rushing back? What did I know about drowning or being drowned? You would have been born into winter, in the year of the disconnected gas and no car. We would have made the thin walk over Genesee Hill into the Canada wind to watch you slip like ice into strangers' hands. You would have fallen naked as snow into winter. If you were born here, I could tell you these and some other things. If I am ever less than a mountain for your definitive brothers and sisters, let the rivers pour over my head. Let the sea take me for a spiller of seas. Let black men call me stranger, always, for your never-named sake. Later, I'll say I spent my life loving a great man. Later, my life will accuse me of various treasons. Not black enough, too black. Eyes closed when they should have been open. Eyes open when they should have been closed. Will accuse me for unborn babies and dead trees. Later, when I defend again and again with this love, my life will keep silent, listening to my body breaking. Last two poems by John Murillo, contemporary young poet. Enter the Dragon, Los Angeles, California, 1976. For me, the movie starts with a black man leaping into an orbit of badges, tiny moons catching the sheen of his perfect black afro, arc kicks, karate chops, and 30 cops on their backs. It starts with the swagger, the cool lean into the leather front seat of the black and white he takes often. Deep hallelujahs of moviegoers drown out the wah-wah guitar, salt and butter, high fives, right on brother, and daddy glowing so bright he can light the screen all by himself. This is how it goes down. Friday night, and my father drives us home from the late show, two heroes Cadillacing across King Boulevard. In the car's dark cab, we jab and clutch, Jim Kelly and Bruce Lee with popcorn breath, and almost miss the lights flashing in the cracked side mirror. I know what's under the seat, but when the uniforms approach from the rear quarter panel, when the fat one leans so far into my father's window, I can smell his long day's work. When my father, this John Henry of a man, hides his hammer, doesn't buck, tucks away his baritone, license and registration shaking as if showing a bathroom pass to a grade school principal, I learned the difference between cinema and city, between the movie house cheers of old men and the silence that gets us home. The Prisoner's Wife. To touch him. Where? Scapula? Vertebrae? I have to let him hear my voice first. Hum something he knows. Make sure he's awake. Been this way since he's back in the world. I have to whisper soft as a child. First time I reached for him in the dark, I learned. Like his first night home, in that world I imagined the shanks and showers, bigger men if they touched him. In the dark, I've learned not to ask. What fingers may have grazed his skin? It's not for me to know. Let me run this man a bath. That he's even here is a miracle. 7 years I've waited to glaze his fingers, his skin, to sing his name until he learns it right. My risen black Lazarus, here, 7 summers still intact. Tonight, Watch these nails cut wings into his back. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Verna Senate, and I represent the women basketball for Miami-Dade College. And today I will be talking about the most beautiful, great, fabulous Madam C.J. Walker. 1867, Sarah Breedlove, later known as Madam C.J. Walker, was born in Delta, Louisiana on December 23rd. 1874, Breedlove's parents are stricken with yellow fever and died back then. And back then, there wasn't any vaccine to cure it at the time. When her parents had died, her and her sisters moved to Vicksburg, Mississippi. That's where she had gotten married to Jeff McWilliams. Jeff McWilliams died, and Sarah moves to St. Louisiana, Missouri, with her 2-year-old daughter, Layla, later known as Alila. Okay, now this is where the pot is starting to boil. There are at least 2 explanations for what happened next. Some people believe that McWilliams analyzed the hair product that used corporized the formula and added her own secret ingredient, which was probably sulfur. But according to McWilliams, God, answers my prayer. For one night I had a dream, and in that dream a big black man appeared to me and told me what to mix up for my hair. Some of the remedy was grown in Africa, but I sent for it, mixed it, put it in my own scalp, and in a few weeks my hair was coming in faster than it had ever fallen out. By about 1905, Sarah McWilliams realized that by solving her hair problem, she had found a way to better her life. As she later explained, quote unquote, I tried it on my friends, it helped them, I made up my mind to begin to sell it. But first, instead of trying to compete with the poorer company in St. Louisiana, McWilliams decided to move. This time, she went to Denver, Colorado. Determined to start her new business, she adjusted fast, quote unquote. There is no royal flower strewn the road to success, she said. If there is, I have not found it. For what success I have attained in the result of many sleepless nights and hard work. McWilliams rented a room in the attic where she perfected her formula, night after night. She experimented by mixing different ingredients in her wash tub. During the day, she washed clothes. She was also a cook, probably at a lunch counter in a drugstore. Within months, McWilliams developed 3 products that worked beautiful on her hair and her nieces: wonderful hair growth, glossing, and vegetable shampoo. She also resigned a steel comb with wider gaps between the teeth to use with thicker hair that black people usually have. Carefully groomed and usually dressed in white blouse and a long dark skirt, McWilliams started selling her products door to door. She always gave her free demonstrations by washing the customer's hair with vegetable shampoo. Then she put wonderful hair grower on the customer's hair and scalp to control dandruff and other scalp problems. Next, she applied the glosser, or a light oil, to soften the hair and pressed it with a steel comb that she had heated on the stove. The steel comb is no joke. What you do is you put the steel comb on the oven, and then if your hair is curly, you place it on your hair and it gets it straight. That was kind of the worst experience of my life, because when I seen that comb come by my eye, I happened to just move and jump everywhere because it was very hot. Next, she applied the glycerin or light oil to soften the hair and pressed it with the steel comb that she had heated on the stove. By using the oil and hot comb, McWilliams straightened out the tight curls that most of her black customers had left their hair shiny and smooth. She eventually called her approach the Walker hair care method. She wrote letters about her success to Charles Joseph Walker, who had become her close friend and advised when she lived in St. Louis. Walker, a newspaper man known as CJ, responded with encouragement, and he gave her advice about advertising and promotion. Soon he came to Denver on January 4th, 1906. He and McWilliams were married. From then on, McWilliams used the name Madam C.J. Walker, a name that she thought sounded good. C.J. Walker was satisfied when Madam Business started earning $10 a day, and he thought she should be too. But she was not. According to Madam, I quote unquote, I was convinced that my hair preparation would fill a long felt want. And when we found it impossible to agree due to his narrowness of vision, I embarked in business for myself. As Walker's hair care method became more popular, it also became controversial. Some black people accused Walker of straightening black women's hair to make it look like white women's hair. Black ministers said that if black people were supposed to have straight hair, then God would have given it to them. And Madam C.J. Walker said this, "Let me correct the erroneous impression held by some that I claim to straighten hair." Madam Walker replied, "I deplored such an impression because I have always held myself out as a hair culturist. True, Walker's method straightened black women's hair, but according to Walker, her purpose was to help women have healthy hair and scalps." Walker also stressed the importance of cleanliness and personal hygiene. One of her advertisements read, "The key to beauty, success, and happiness is a good appearance." In 1912, George Knox told Walker about the National Negro Business League, which is called NNBL, convention in Chicago. He was going and he thought the members should hear about their success. Walker agreed to him in Chicago, but during the convention, Booker T. Washington, the president, ignored Knox's efforts to introduce Walker. Finally, Walker jumped to her feet and addressed Washington herself. "Surely you are not going to shut the door in my face. I feel that I am in a business that is credit to the womanhood of our race. I am a woman who came from the cotton field of the South. I was promoted from there to the wash tub, then I was promoted to the cook kitchen, and from there I promoted myself into the business of manufacturing hair goods and preparation. I have built my own factory on my own ground." Washington never ignored Walker again. In fact, he invited her to speak in the next NNBL convention. That same year, Walker divorced C.J. Walker. She also became a grandmother when Aaliyah had added the A, who had also divorced her husband, adopted Mae Bryant. Walker loved her new granddaughter, Mae, who had long, thick hair, sometimes traveled with Walker and modeled her products. Harlem was an exciting place to be. A huge migration of people from the rural South to the cities of the North and just begun and would continue throughout the 1920s. This shift in population was called the Great Migration. Harlem, which drew the largest number of people, became known as the Negro Mecca. Black poets, writers, artists, and musicians were settling there. Businesses owned by black people were thriving. "There is such more joy living in New York," Walker exclaimed in a letter to Ransom. That same year, Walker organized her agents into local groups called the Madam C.J. Walker Hair Culturists Union of America. "We organized mainly for the protection of the agents and to keep others from infringing on their prices by selling the goods under price." She wrote to Ransom's agents, attended local meetings and national conventions. They received awards for the community work. Madam C.J. Walker became very rich and very famous. She continued to promote her business, but she also enjoyed the money it had brought her. She loved cars, clothes, jewelry, and giving elegant parties. She loved music and brought a gold-leaving grand piano and harp, a ceiling-high organ, and a state-of-the-art Victrola of phonograph. That same year, Walker agents sent a telegram from their national convention to Wilson's to protect against the continuation of such wrongs and injustice in the land of the free and home of the brave. In 1918, Walker moved again. She had built a spectacular 30-room mansion on a 4.5-acre estate high above the Hudson River in Irvington on Hudson. Irvington, not far from the New York City, was a small town of mostly wealthy white people. For several years, Ransom had asked Walker to rest. She had high blood pressure, and he worried about her health, but Madam C.J. Walker would not slow down. Finally, during a trip to St. Louis in 1919, Walker became so ill that she was rushed home in a private railroad car. At Villa Leroy, her doctor told her that her condition was grave. Ransom arrived from Indianapolis, and Walker gave him instructions, including a list of organizations to help with gifts of money. One day in May 1919, Walker's nurse heard her say, "I want to live to help my race." Those were her last words. She went into a coma on May 25, 1919. Madam C.J. Walker died. She was 51 years old. After a funeral at Villa Leroy, Madam C.J. Walker was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in New York City. Scores of people and organizations honored Walker's memory with glowing words, but of all spoken and written tributes, Madam C.J. Walker's own words described her best. Perseverance is my motto. I am Verna Senate, and I represent the women's basketball team, and thank you for your support and listening.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Marisa Murphy, and I represent volleyball team. I'll be reading Going to School During the Civil Rights Movement. In the late 1600s, slave traders began kidnapping Africans and bringing them to the North American as slaves. Slave traders sold most of these Africans to plantation owners. Plantation owners depended on the slaves to work in their large fields. In 1801, it became illegal for slave traders to bring new slaves to the United States, but plantation owners continued to buy and sell American-born Africans. Slaves led difficult lives. Men, women, and children worked 6 days a week during hard labor. Slave children began working around age 5 or 6. Some plantation owners harshly punished slaves who complained. Plantation owners often broke up slave families by selling some members to other plantations. Slaves lived in crude 1- or 2-room cabins in the plantation slave quarters. Enslaved Africans wanted to be free. By the mid-1800s, slavery was illegal in many northern U.S. states. Many slaves ran away from plantations and escaped to the north on the Underground Railroad. This system of safe houses and secret routes ran from southern states to the north and Canada. Many people who opposed slavery took escaped slaves into their houses and hid them from slave catchers. After the North defeated the South in Civil War 1861 to 1865, all African Americans were free from slavery, but many whites still treated African Americans poorly. Many white Southerners were bitter about losing the war. They did not want African Americans getting an education and taking jobs that used to be only for whites. Throughout the South and in some parts of the North, city officials built separate bathrooms, restaurants, schools, shops, and theaters for African Americans. Many African Americans also lived in separate neighborhoods. These segregated areas were often run down and poorly kept. In 1909, a multiracial group of people founded the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, also known as NAACP. This organization was devoted to gaining and protecting equal rights for African Americans. In the 1950s, the NAACP began working for desegregation and equal rights. This struggle for equality was called the Civil Rights Movement. Over time, this movement changed laws and affected life in the United States forever. People who worked in the Civil Rights Movement were called civil rights activists. Civil rights activists were people of all races. Many civil rights activists participated in marches, boycotts, sit-ins, and voter registration drives, hoping to end segregation and change racial laws. These demonstrations attracted the attention of the U.S. government. Demonstrations were a peaceful way of showing the U.S. government that African Americans wanted equality. But during many demonstrations, police officers and local whites attacked civil rights activists. Police officers arrested and fined activists even though their demonstrations were peaceful. In 1961, civil rights activists organized freedom rides in the eastern United States. People began these bus rides after the U.S. government outlawed segregation on public transportation. Freedom riders were activists who rode from state to state on desegregated and intersegregated buses. Much violence took place during the Civil Rights Movement. Many African Americans and civil rights activists were killed in mob attacks and lynchings. Hate groups such as the Ku Klux Klan or KKK often used what they call lynch law, to justify killing civil rights activists and African Americans. If a person was accused of a crime, the mob believed they had the right to hang the accused without a fair trial. Mobs wrongly accused most lynch victims. Mob members often were unpunished. Many people participated in the civil rights movement. Together, civil rights activists made changes in the government, laws that they could not have made alone. These changes included school desegregation, the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and establishment of citizenship schools. Segregated schools. In 1950s, most U.S. schools were segregated. Many people in northern and southern states felt that white children and African American children should not attend the same school. In urban areas, African American students attended their own public schools. These schools had indoor plumbing and electricity like schools for white children, but many of the schools were run down and in need of repairs. In rural areas, African Americans often held classes in abandoned cabins, mule stables, tobacco barns, and churches. Many rural schools were crude, one-room buildings with shaky floors, cracks in the walls and roofs, and only a pot-bellied stove for heat. In most cases, the only way for an African American community to build a new building was to close the school for several months and use the teacher's salary to pay for building supplies. African American schools were in constant risk of being vandalized. Groups such as the KKK sometimes set fire to African American schools. Some families organized secret schools in rural areas to keep students safe. They held classes on different days each week or in different buildings to keep the school a secret. White children and adults sometimes harassed African American students on their way to school. The sight of African American students carrying books angered whites who did not believe African Americans deserved an education. Children often hid their books in market baskets until they reached the schoolhouse to keep them from being harassed. The NAACP fought for school integration. In the 1950s, the NAACP took a series of cases to the U.S. Supreme Court. These cases combined in Brown versus the Board of Education. Linda Brown was a 7-year-old student who lived in Kansas. She traveled across town to attend an African-American school, even though there was a white school nearby. During the hearing, NAACP attorneys argued that forcing students to attend separate schools because of race made African-American children feel bad about themselves. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the NAACP. The court ruled that even though the school buildings may be equal, separating children according to race was harmful to their self-esteem. NAACP attorneys proved that segregation in education had long-lasting effects on children. The courts forced schools to integrate. Many people still opposed integrated schools. The first African-American students to attend white schools were often teased and harassed while on their way to classes. In 1957, 9 students tried to attend Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, but state officers did not let them into the building. The 9 students were Minnie Jean Brown, Elizabeth Eckford, Ernest Green, Thelma Mother Shedd, Melba Patillo, Gloria Ray, Terrence Roberts, Jefferson Thomas, and Carlotta Walls. The U.S. government sent federal troops to protect the students from angry white students and parents. Troops escorted the Little Rock 9 into school and walked with them between classes. Some African Americans dropped out of white schools because they did not want to be harassed. African American parents sometimes pulled their children out of schools because angry whites threatened their lives. The result pleased segregationists. They hoped African American parents would not want their children to attend integrated schools, but many African American students remained in integrated schools, so African American students continued to attend. Many white children were unsure of how to act toward African American students. They were not used to attending racially mixed schools white students sometimes teased other white classmates for being friends with African American students. Some white children were afraid to include African American students in games or choose them as partners in class projects. They did not want to be harassed, but many white children showed courage by befriending African American students despite taunts from classmates. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Professor Emily Adams, and I teach in the English and Communications Department here at the Kendall campus. And today I have chosen a selection from Maya Angelou to read. This is a short story that some of you students in E&C 1101 may be familiar with. It's in the text, and I love this story. It shows the ability of a poet such as Maya Angelou to use her descriptive language and bring it into a narrative to get a slice of life to show what life was like for her in the Deep South following segregation, or following the Civil War, but during the time of segregation. She's a 10-year-old girl. Her perspective is spot on for a 10-year-old girl, and her themes are enlarged beyond her own race and culture to include anybody who has ever experienced hate or even simply been called a name. Okay. This is called Finishing School. Recently, a white woman from Texas who would quickly describe herself as a liberal asked me about my hometown. When I told her that in stamps, my grandmother had owned the only Negro general merchandise store since the turn of the century, she exclaimed, "Why, you were a debutante." Ridiculous and even ludicrous. But Negro girls in small southern towns, whether poverty-stricken or just munching along on a few of life's necessities, were given as extensive and irrelevant preparations for adulthood as rich white girls shown in magazines. Admittedly, the training was not the same. While white girls learned to waltz and sit gracefully with a teacup balanced on their knees, we were lagging behind, learning the mid-Victorian values with very little money to indulge them. We were required to embroider, and I had trunkfuls of colorful dish towels, pillowcases, runners, and handkerchiefs to my credit. I mastered the art of crocheting and tatting, and there was a lifetime supply of dainty doilies that would never be used in sashayed dresser drawers. It went without saying that all girls could iron and wash, but the finer touches around the home, like setting a table with real silver, baking roasts, and cooking vegetables without meat, had to be learned elsewhere, usually at the source of those habits. During my 10th year, a white woman's kitchen became my finishing school. Mrs. Viola Cullinan was a plump woman who lived in a 3-bedroom house somewhere behind the post office. She was singularly unattractive until she smiled, and then the lines around her eyes and mouth, which made her look perpetually dirty, disappeared, and her face looked like the mask of an impish elf. She usually rested her smile until late afternoon when her women friends dropped in and Miss Glory, the cook, served them cold drinks on the closed-in porch. The exactness of her house was inhuman. This glass went here and only here. That cup had its place, and it was an act of impudent rebellion to place it anywhere else. At 12 o'clock, the table was set. At 12:15, Mrs. Cullinan sat down to dinner, whether her husband had arrived or not. At 12:16, Miss Glory brought out the food. It took me a week to learn the difference between a salad plate, a bread plate, and a dessert plate. Mrs. Cullinan kept up the tradition of her wealthy parents. She was from Virginia. Miss Glory, who was a descendant of slaves that had worked for the Cullinans, told me her history. She had married beneath her, according to Miss Glory. Her husband's family hadn't had their money very long, and what they had didn't mount to much. As ugly as she was, I thought privately, she was lucky to get a husband above or beneath her station. But Miss Glory wouldn't let me say a thing against her mistress. She was very patient with me, however, over the housework. She explained the dishware, silverware, and servants' bells. The large round bowl in which soup was served wasn't a soup bowl, it was a tureen. There were goblets, sherbet glasses, ice cream glasses, wine glasses, green glass coffee cups with matching saucers, and water glasses. I had a glass to drink from, and it sat with Miss Glory's on a separate shelf from the others. Soup spoons, gravy boat, butter knives, salad forks, and carving platter were additions to my vocabulary, and in fact almost represented a new language. I was fascinated with the novelty, with the fluttering Mrs. Cullinan and her Alice in Wonderland house. Her husband remains in my memory undefined. I lumped him with all the other white men that I had ever seen and tried not to see. On our way home one evening, Miss Glory told me that Mrs. Cullinan couldn't have children. She said that she was too delicate-boned. It was hard to imagine bones at all under those layers of fat. Miss Glory went on to say that the doctor had taken out all her lady organs. I reasoned that a pig's organs included the lungs, heart, and liver, so if Mrs. Cullinan was walking around without those essentials, it explained why she drank alcohol out of unmarked bottles. She was keeping herself embalmed. When I spoke to Bailey about it, he agreed that I was right, but he also informed me that Mr. Cullinan had 2 daughters by a colored lady and that I knew them very well. He added that the girls were the spitting image of their father. I was unable to remember what he looked like, although I had just left him a few hours before, but I thought of the Coleman girls. They were very light-skinned and certainly didn't look very much like their mother. No one ever mentioned Mr. Coleman. My pity for Mrs. Cullinan preceded me the next morning like the Cheshire Cat's smile. Those girls who could have been his daughters were beautiful. They didn't have to straighten their hair. Even when they were caught in the rain, their braids still hung down straight like tamed snakes. Their mouths were pouty little Cupid's bows. Mrs. Cullinan didn't know what she had missed, or maybe she did. Poor Mrs. Cullinan. For weeks after, I arrived early, left late, and tried very hard to make up for her barrenness. If she had had her own children, she wouldn't have had to ask me to run 1,000 errands from her back door to the back door of her friends. Poor old Mrs. Cullinan. Then one evening, Miss Glory told me to serve the ladies on the porch. After I set the tray down and turned toward the kitchen, one of the women asked, "What's your name, girl?" It was a speckled-faced one. Mrs. Cullinan said, "She doesn't talk much. Her name's Margaret." "Is she dumb?" "No, as I understand it, she can talk when she wants to, but she's usually quiet as a little mouse. Aren't you, Margaret?" I smiled at her. Poor thing, no organs, and couldn't even pronounce my name correctly. "She's a sweet little thing, though." "Well, that may be, but your name's too long. I'd never bother myself. I'd call her Mary if I was you." I fumed into the kitchen. That horrible woman would never have the chance to call me Mary, because if I was starving, I'd never work for her. That evening, I decided to write a poem on being white, fat, old, and without children. It was going to be a tragic ballad. I would have to watch her carefully to capture the essence of her loneliness and pain. The very next day, she called me by the wrong name. Miss Glory and I were washing up the lunch dishes when Mrs. Cullinan came to the doorway. "Mary?" Miss Glory asked, "Who?" Mrs. Cullinan, sagging a little, knew, and I knew. "I want Mary to go down to Mrs. Randall's and take her some soup. She's not been feeling well for a few days." Miss Glory's face was a wonder to see. "You mean Margaret, ma'am. Her name's Margaret." "That's too long. She's Mary from now on. Heat the soup from last night and put it in the china tureen, and Mary, I want you to carry it carefully." Every person I knew had a hellish horror of being called out of his name. It was a dangerous practice to call a Negro anything that could be loosely construed as insulting because of the centuries of their having been called niggers, jigs, dinges, blackbirds, crows, boots, and spooks. Miss Glory had a fleeting second of feeling sorry for me. Then as she handed me the hot tureen, she said, "Don't mind, don't pay that no mind. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but words, you know, I've been working here for 20 years. She held the back door open for me. 20 years, I wasn't much older than you. My name used to be Hallelujah. That's what Ma'n named me, but my mistress gave me Glory, and it stuck. I likes it better too." I was in the little path that ran behind the houses when Miss Glory shouted, "It's shorter too." For a few seconds, it was a toss-up whether I would laugh, imagine being named Hallelujah, or cry, imagine letting some white woman rename you for her convenience. My anger saved me from either outburst. I had to quit the job, but the problem was going to be how to do it. Mama wouldn't allow me to quit for just any reason. "She's a peach. That woman is a real peach," Mrs. Randall's maid was talking as she took the soup for me, and I wondered what her name used to be and what she answered to now. For a week I looked into Mrs. Cullinan's face as she called me Mary. She ignored my coming late and leaving early. Miss Glory was a little annoyed because I had begun to leave egg yolk on the dishes and wasn't putting much heart into polishing the silver. I hoped that she would complain to our boss, but she didn't. Then Bailey solved my dilemma. He had me describe the contents of the cupboard and the particular plates that she liked best. Her favorite piece was a casserole shaped like a fish and the green glass coffee cups. I kept his instructions in mind, so on the next day, when Miss Glory was hanging out clothes and I had again been told to serve the old biddies on the porch, I dropped the empty serving tray. When I heard Mrs. Cullinan scream, "Mary!" I picked up the casserole and 2 of the green glass cups in readiness. As she rounded the kitchen door, I let them fall on the tiled floor. I could never absolutely describe to Bailey what happened next because each time I got to the part where she fell on the floor and screwed up her ugly face to cry, we burst out laughing. She actually wobbled around on the floor and picked up shards of the cups and cried, "Oh, Mama, oh, dear God, it's Mama's china from Virginia. Oh, Mama, I'm sorry." Miss Glory came running in from the yard and the women from the porch crowded around. Miss Glory was almost as broken up as her mistress. "You mean to say she broke our Virginia dishes? What we gonna do?" Mrs. Cullinan cried louder, "That clumsy nigger, clumsy little black nigger." Old Speckled Face leaned down and asked, "Who did it, Viola? Was it Mary? Who did it?" Everything was happening so fast, I can't remember whether her action preceded her words, but I know that Mrs. Cullinan said, "Her name's Margaret, goddammit, her name's Margaret," and she threw a wedge of broken plate at me. It could have been the hysteria which put her aim off, but the flying crockery caught Miss Glory right over her ear and she started screaming. I left the front door wide open so all the neighbors could hear. Mrs. Cullinan was right about one thing. My name wasn't Mary.